Okay, thank you everybody for coming to the closing plenary of BECC 2021. And if I haven't mentioned it before, I'm just thrilled to have everybody here. You, the BECC audience, has been so helpful. You are the ones that make the conference fantastic. And up till now, the engagement has been fantastic, just off the charts. And the speakers have been wonderful. And it's my pleasure to bring us to today's closing plenary. Thank you for coming. My name is Reuben Sussman. As I mentioned, I work for ACEEE, and I'm one of the co-chairs of BECC. I want to thank again today's sponsor, ICF, who's sponsoring all of today's sessions. Please remember right after this session to complete the evaluation that will be sent to you. Well, I think we sent it to you first thing today, but we'll also send it to you at 5 o'clock. You can use Socio to connect with anybody you met at the conference, even afterwards. The recordings of the sessions will be available, I have in January here, but we'll try to get them to you sooner than that. It's just a matter of finishing editing them and re-uploading, which takes a little bit of time, but they will be made public for everyone here and then to the general public after that. Keep the conversation going with BECC, with us. Every month we will have a free monthly webinar. Join us in our LinkedIn group. We're also on Twitter and Facebook, so don't forget to join those. And of course, next year, we will be thrilled to see you in person in DC, November 14th to 16th. Thanks again to our sponsors for the conference. ICF sponsored today, but overall, we could not have accomplished this conference without the important support of these very important sponsors and those that really made the conference happen. So thanks again to those sponsors. And just normally we'd be all in person, we'd ask people to stand up, and I wanted to say, thanks to everybody who helped organize the conference. And I want to particularly draw your attention to two folks who are so critical, who really worked tirelessly, lost some hairs, got some more gray hairs. Joanna and Carolee, thank you so much for making this conference the best it could be. And of course, we couldn't have done it without you. And I also wanted to say thank you to the tech operators. A lot of you who are speakers might know these folks, but the rest of you, by design, do not. And that's because everything went well. Without these volunteers and the time that they contributed to the conference, it simply wouldn't happen. So thank you very much to all the tech operators. Okay, so now let's get to the plenary. You have, as usual, with all the plenaries, we have the Q&A box for questions. So if you want to interact with the people that you see on screen, use the Q&A box. If you want to interact with each other, use the chat box. So keep that conversation going. And actually, let's get things started. Who here has a book or a journal that they think is important? Put into the chat. I'd be very curious to see. If you have a book that's been inspiring you or that you're interested in, that have made you think, or, and this is actually really critical for us and to those on the panel, what journals are you reading? What's the journal that speaks to this community? I would love to hear that. So put that into the chat while we're getting started here. Now, if you do put in questions to the Q&A, I will ask them to our panelists at the end of the session. And like I mentioned, this session, all the sessions will be recorded. So I'm very excited to now introduce, let's see if we have anything in the chat here. So I don't see any people telling us the books they're reading just yet. Oh, Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, Breakfast of Biodiversity, interesting. The Sum of Us, The Spirit of Green. Diffusive Innovations, a classic, yeah. We Are the Weather. What are Nudge, right, also a classic. We actually had Cuss Sunstein at BECC a few years ago. And if you have journals that you think are important, academic or otherwise, that'd be great to hear too. In Defense of Food. Thanks, Karen. Okay, this has been exciting. I am going to now turn it over to our panel. And I'm very excited. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Tom Dietz. He'll now be taking it from here to share the rest of the session with you.
Thanks, Reuben. Let me get my share screen started here. I just wanted to say how very excited we are to be here. We all have the greatest respect for BECCS. We've been involved in BECCS on and off for many years. And this is the kind of conference that really captures the spirit of what we want to do. We want to have the best science engaged. and also be engaged with the application of that science, and the application in turn informs practice. So the panel today is myself, I'm at Michigan State University, Rachel Schwamm at Rutgers, Paul Stern from the Social and Environmental Research Institute, and Mike Vandenberg at Vanderbilt. And our goal today is to try to provoke analysis of what kinds of actions will actually prompt greenhouse gas reductions. There are many good ideas about actions and technologies that could reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but too little analysis of which of these can actually reduce emissions quickly. We understand that the urgency of mitigating climate change requires, we think, a rigorous approach to assessing the possibilities and setting priorities. This is no news at BECC. From the start, BECC has emphasized building new initiatives based on evidence about what works and what doesn't work. And the sessions I've attended have been filled with that kind of discourse. What have we learned from actual experience? How does that feed back to a scientific understanding? And back and forth between the science and actual field experience and program design and policy design. So in some sense, we're talking to the converted here. But what we think we might be useful in adding is a systematic way to think about how to determine what is actually going to reduce emissions quickly. That is, criteria for assessments. And we're very much in the spirit of what's been called Ostrom's law. If it works in practice, it can work in theory. Paul and I had the great good fortune to work with Lynn Ostrom. Lynn, as you may know, was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Economics for her wonderful interdisciplinary work on commons. She would love BECC because she was always engaged in the science at the deepest level, but also engaged in practice about how do you manage commons around the world. So this session is really in her spirit as well. So here are the criteria that we're going to be talking about and trying to deploy. When someone starts an initiative, that is an action of some sort to encourage changes in behavior, adoption of technology, or so on, the first thing you have to do is, well, who are the change agents? Who's going to try to bring about the change? And whose behavior or actions are they trying to change? The responders. The responders might be households. They might be government agencies. They might be corporations. And change agents can be governments, corporations, social movements, et cetera. So it's important to identify those clearly. And then we think it's useful to think about 5 questions in looking at a potential initiative. What's the technical potential? How much reduction in emissions would result if the opportunity were fully realized, if an initiative reached its full objectives? And the literature is filled with analyses of technical potential of policies, of programs, of technology. We're not short on that. But what we think it's important to do is to move beyond that. The next thing we think it's important to look at is behavioral plasticity. To what extent will an initiative, as implemented, yield the intended results with the intended responders? How much will people, households, governments change? Initiative feasibility. How likely is it that the change agent will actually be able to adopt and implement effectively a mitigation policy? We've seen lots of good ideas for policies and programs that never get implemented. Because climate change is an urgent problem, because reductions in greenhouse gases that occur now and in the immediate future are extremely important, we want to think about how quickly an initiative can come online and start reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then because many of the kinds of policies and programs we're thinking about have important distributional impacts, we also always want to think about equity. So as we're going through this, what we're going to do is first have Mike present some ideas about what gets in our way of thinking clearly about what initiatives are actually going to move us forward quickly and which ones won't. He's going to walk through those. And then we're going to present 3 examples using this kind of framework to clarify how we think it's useful. But while we're doing that, we want you to draw on your experience and expertise. So as we proceed, if you think of ideas for initiatives that you think will score well on our criteria, post them in the Q&A so that we can hear them, be inspired by them. Again, the criteria are technical potential, how much could possibly happen, behavioral plasticity, how hard or easy is it to get people, organizations, et cetera, to change, initiative feasibility, what's the likelihood of actually getting a good program or policy in place, how quickly things can come online, and equity concerns. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Thanks so much, Tom, and thanks to Reuben and to everyone involved with BECC. So it sounds like it's just been a wonderful conference, and I've enjoyed the parts of it I've participated in. So my job here, as Tom mentioned, is to provide a little context. Why worry about a set of criteria that would help us select remedies to problems? And basically, when we have a problem that is as urgent, as important as climate change, we can't afford not to take some rigorous looks at what might really work and what might not. And to do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the notion of a carbon tax and how long that's been around. And then I'm going to look at 4 different types of biases or problems that get in the way of our ability to apply these criteria. And let me start with assessing the political barriers. So I served as the EPA Chief of Staff early in the Clinton administration. And the good news is that we proposed the first, in the environmental budget for the Clinton administration, the first carbon tax called a BTU tax at the time. And the bad news is we proposed the first one and they're still talking about it, right? We lost that game. And my point is simply, we've now been talking about a carbon tax for 3 decades. And I'm a fan of a carbon tax. I think it would provide a very positive, low-cost solution to the climate problem. By the same token, I think the idea of a carbon tax, if we're not careful, can displace other less attractive ideas that might be somewhat more feasible. So from my perspective, the carbon tax saga tells us a little something about the importance of accounting for the criteria that we're about to talk about, particularly the feasibility of those criteria. So Tom, let's move next to the Panacea bias in the next slide. So as Tom's making that change, this is another reference to Eleanor Ostrom, because she was the source of the notion of a panacea bias here. And the idea here is that what we tend to do is we tend to look to panaceas to solve problems, rather than looking for assembling a whole set of sub-panaceas, things that won't actually totally solve the problem. And the challenge is, if we focus on that silver bullet or that panacea, we can exclude more feasible options that won't solve the problem, but that in combination might solve the problem. And the concept of wedges, which many of us have worked on through the concept of a behavioral wedge, is one way to get at that. We're not solving the problem, but we're advancing the ball. And we're doing that by avoiding this panacea bias, this likelihood to only favor those options that will completely solve the problem, even if they're not feasible in the near time. So let's go on to the next slide. So one of the things that I see often is a form of Disney's law. And this is something the President's science advisor, John Gibbons, mentioned. It's the idea that wishing will make it true. And I think a good way to think about this is to be very careful to understand what the current state of our political system is. We've had remarkable sorting and political polarization and political partisanship as well. And one of the best ways to think this through, in my view, is the very sophisticated and very thoughtful Six Americas study. And if you look at the Six Americas study and how it's often discussed in social media and in traditional media, what you often hear is that we've seen substantial progress, which is true, from the alarmed and concerned group, roughly 48% back in 2008, having grown all the way to 55% of the US population today. I would just say that the challenge is that the population that isn't either alarmed or concerned, that fits into the cautious and disengaged and doubtful and skeptical categories, has declined, but it has declined from 52% to 45%. So then the question is, can we make major federal policy if 45% of the population is something other than alarmed or concerned? And let's go to the next slide and take a hard look at that question. So the country, if you just look at polling, is probably center to center left, but given our democratic design, it functions like it's a center right country. And the simple analysis is that 55% of the population, as we've seen in the last year, is simply insufficient for major federal climate statutes and for consistent federal policy. Why is that true? Well, if you step back and you look at the US population, it's roughly divided: a third independents, a third Republicans, and a third Democrats. Those numbers shift over time. As to liberals and conservatives, conservatives tend to be a little higher than liberals, but again, they're reasonably easily balanced. And yet, because we have sorted as a population, both in terms of the information that we get and the people who are our friends and colleagues and who go to religious services with us and we live next to, we all think that more people are in our club than in the other club. And so one of the challenges then, given the sorting and polarization, is what that means for our political system and the ability to get a major federal climate response. So what does that mean? Well, the House of Representatives right now, for example, has roughly a 3-vote majority by the Democrats. The average number of seats that the party in power, if the party shares the White House, loses in a midterm election is 37, and the low end for other elections has been 12. So that just gives you a sense of the challenge that's looming over the next year. In the United States Senate, roughly 18% of the US population lives in a state that controls 50 votes in the Senate. And the US Senate, of course, has the confirmation ability for the Supreme Court, which is why we now have a 6-3 Supreme Court that is expressing some skepticism about the climate issue. And the Supreme Court just last week took cert on a case that was a surprise to many lawyers that signals that the court is going to narrow the authority of EPA to regulate greenhouse gases under the existing statutory regime. We don't know for sure, but it's hard to explain why they would have taken cert on that case if that's not true. And of course, the president also is subject to election through the Electoral College, which in turn is largely biased in the direction of the more rural, lower population states. And then lastly, we turn to states as actors, and roughly 50% of US carbon emissions are coming from states that are interested in doing something about climate and pushing for it, and roughly 50% from states that are not. The bottom line then is that it's a challenge, given the levels of public concern about climate change right now, to assume that all we're going to get is major federal climate legislation and that we can rely on that as our answer. Tom, next slide. So again, here's another look just at changes. If you look at the support for doing something about climate as a major federal priority, what you see is really strong growth among Democrats over the last decade. Unfortunately, what you see among independents is roughly no change to a slight decline, and you see roughly the same thing among Republicans as well. And again, given the Democratic design we have, that's a challenge if the answer is let's put all of our eggs in one big major federal statutory change. Let's take a look at the next slide. So maybe the issue we're dealing with, climate change, is not polarized, but the answer is no. It sometimes scores as the most polarized issue among voters in the United States today. It doesn't always come out at the top, but it's always near the top. And in this particular poll, it was near the top. So it's subject to this deep partisan divide. Let's take a look at the next slide. Does that matter or not? Well, if you take a look at the League of Conservation voter scores for members of the House and the Senate, what you see is a surprising amount of similarity leading up to about 1990. The dotted lines and the solid lines here are members of the House and Senate. The blue are the Democrats and the red are the Republicans. And then what you see starting around 1990 and then growing rapidly afterwards is a deep partisan split over environmental votes. These are, again, based on the LCV scores. And so what's the significance of that? We have had essentially no major pollution control legislation since 1990 in the United States. One or two more minor exceptions, but essentially we've had no major pollution control statutes. So perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised with the kind of gridlock that we're seeing in DC right now. This is a much deeper phenomenon. It starts with the sorting and polarization of the population. So let's go to the next slide. So does that mean that we should engage in doomism on some level? Absolutely not. But it means that we need to be rigorous, and that's why this group has worked so hard on publishing criteria, ways to think in a very rigorous way about the solutions that are out there if we have a major urgent problem like we do with climate. So one answer is, what else can we do at the national level? Another answer is, what can we do at the state level, particularly in that half of the states that are motivated, and then at the local levels and with the private sector as well. And one area that Jonathan Gilligan, a physicist at Vanderbilt, and I have been arguing we need to take a focus on is looking at what we think of as forks in the road, not getting distracted by shiny metal objects, but instead really honing in on the things that can actually get us 60 to 75% emissions reductions and that are quite feasible as well. And those include, certainly not limited to, but these are the ones that we focus on: decarbonize the electric grid, electrify transportation, electrify buildings, and increase energy efficiency. If you do those things, you can get 70+% emissions reductions, and it's quite viable as a way to do that using our criteria. Let's go to the next slide. So we got to avoid doomism. There's no value, as you all know, as well or better than I do as a lawyer. We have to avoid doomism if we're going to get something done. And there are good reasons to avoid that. I think this is one of the best ones, which is that the price of solar power has declined by roughly 90% in the last decade. We see similar declines in wind power as well. Next slide, Tom. Similarly, when it comes to transportation, what we see here's New York in 1900, and what we see here is all horses. Next slide, pump here. What do we see in 1913? Just 13 years later, all vehicles, right? All motor vehicles. And so we can make these incredibly rapid transitions. That was done in that case without government intervening. Now we're going to need to make a transition toward electric vehicles as well. But that gives us a sense of how rapid social transformations can occur at a very wide level. Next slide. So last two reasons to avoid doomism relate to the powerful role of efficiency. We tend not to see efficiency when it occurs, in part because it's simply the absence of use of electricity in a lot of cases. And this is, I think, a wonderful way to examine how efficiency is playing a very dominant but quiet role in the decarbonization of the United States. Since 2005, it is this pink wedge here. It's the largest reason why we have departed substantially from business as usual carbon emissions. Number 2 on that list is switching from coal to gas. And number 3 on that list, coming in a close third, is switching to renewable power. But from large stationary sources of electric power, talking about CO2 emissions, efficiency is number 1, even though it tends to get less attention than some of the other areas. And I know that's an area many people in the audience are interested in. So let's go to the last slide here. So households in the United States, if we include transportation and household electricity use, emit as much CO2 as all of the sources from all of the countries in Central and Southern America, in South America. And yet, what we see in the last decade is, for the first time since the Second World War, a leveling off and then a decline in per capita household electricity use. And that's a really promising development. What does that suggest? It suggests that a combination, in this case, of government light bulb standards in the 2000s, combined with major retailers like Walmart and Target committing to make LEDs their house brands if they could find attractive light bulbs, actually correlates very closely. If you look at the work of Lucas Davis, an economist at Berkeley, correlates very closely with this leveling off and decline in household electricity use. So for me, that is the last of the reasons I want to provide as examples of why we can be quite optimistic. We're doing a lot here, and the household share is one of the most promising areas from my perspective. So Tom, back to you.
Great, thanks, Mike, and thanks for being right on time. So what we're going to do next is to apply the criteria in 3 kinds of examples. Mike is going to talk about decarbonizing transportation, and he's going to use the criteria, the framework, as a basis for comparison between increasing the use of electric vehicles versus promoting mass transportation. And then Rachel's going to do a different kind of application where she's looking at an actual initiative that's in place and ongoing, the Menus of Change initiative. And then Paul's going to use the criteria in a slightly different way, looking at a category of initiative, community solar. So again, the criteria we're using are the technical potential, how much could you get if everything went perfectly? Behavioral plasticity, how likely are individuals, households, organizations to actually change under an initiative? Initiative feasibility, how likely are you to get the initiative? And of course, Mike gave us a sobering example of what has happened with carbon taxes. The pace of implementation, how quickly can the initiative come online and start reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And equity, what are the distributional impacts? And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to Mike for the first example.
Great, and thank you, Tom. And I'll be brief because I really want to hear from Rachel and Paul here. But I just wanted to provide one way to look at the criteria that Tom just talked about. And so what I thought I would do is just think from the perspective of someone living here in Nashville, a blue dot in a red sea, growing city. What is it likely to be able to do if what it wants to do is decarbonize its transportation, which makes up a surprisingly large share here in Nashville because we have a very large highway system and a very limited mass transport system. So the question then in a city like Nashville, and again, this is not a sophisticated quantitative analysis, it's just an example of how we might try to begin applying our criteria to make sure we're focusing our resources, whether they're public or private resources for decarbonization, in the places that will actually help us get rapid major emissions reductions. And so if we think about technical potential, clearly if we can get mass transport, I've worked on 2 different mass transport initiatives here in Nashville. The answer is if we can get mass transport here, we could have very high total emissions reductions if we can get people out of cars and trucks and into a mass transit system. Similarly, if we can electrify motor vehicles, even with the current carbon intensity of our grid, which is good but not great, we can reduce carbon emissions substantially. And if our grid rapidly decarbonizes, we can close to eliminate emissions. So both these have very high emissions reductions potential. Their technical potential is quite high. Then we move to behavioral plasticity. A challenge, I think it differs a lot if you live in New York or DC, where I used to live. The usership of mass transportation is very high. If you live in the South, that's a bigger challenge. And so for at least many cities in the US, the plasticity, the changeability of the behavior of the people who would use mass transit is low. And it's moderate or high when it comes to electric vehicles. We're seeing already uptake of electric vehicles in fleets and at the individual level at surprisingly high rates. So my view on this would be, and again, this is just my gut, you may have a very different view, is that as to behavioral plasticity, the mass transit side is fairly low. The electric vehicle side is high. It's not that I'm not a fan of mass transit. I'm just trying to take a hard look at the likelihood that we'll get levels of utilization among the target audience. And then we move to initiative feasibility. As I mentioned, I've worked on 2 of these initiatives. Both of them have failed. And the latter of them to the extent that the legislature took back authority from the city to actually govern the roads within the city itself. So from my perspective, the chance that we'll get mass transit, even though it has the highest likely ultimate technical potential, has a fairly low initiative feasibility, at least over the next 5 to 10 years. Electric vehicles, on the other hand, it's unclear, but probably somewhere in the moderate to high range. They can bypass some of the political polarization. Ford Motor Company just built a massive new EV Ford 150 truck facility in the eastern or western part of the state. And we're beginning to see major movements in this direction. So from my perspective, there's a higher initiative feasibility. What about the pace? I pretty much talked about that. It seems possible, but slower as to mass transit. It seems faster as it relates to electric vehicles. I'd put that at moderate to high in terms of whether there's a fast pace. And I think both of them struggle with questions of equity. Both of them have open questions about the extent to which they'll have effects on disadvantaged populations in the city of Nashville. And that's something we can talk about at much greater length. And this is an area of active research I have underway right now. So I'd be happy during the Q&A to go into more depth about what the implications are for both of these categories. But that's just one way to think through these different estimates. And the reason I find this so attractive as a way to at least structure the conversation is it avoids this Disney's law problem. Well, wishing that we had a perfect solution will make it so. Simply not going to happen in Nashville. So the question is then, what's the best thing we can do given these analytical criteria? And with that, I will pass it over to my colleagues.
Okay, and Rachel is up next. Rachel? Rachel? Not sure.
Rachel, if you can hear me, this is Sharon. You may be on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, great. So I took the perspective of this I've been working some more on food systems and indirect energy use. And it's not that I've gone through every single initiative around food consumption and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but I have some experience with menus of change that's a collaboration between Harvard School of Public Health and the Culinary Institute of America. Rutgers is a participant on the research collaboration side. And so I had some exposure that way. And I thought this was a promising approach to highlight, because it is a group that's cooperatively worked to design principles of healthy and sustainable menus. So it has a multiple objective of improving people's health while also making menus more sustainable, and particularly reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the also it runs a collaborative research program with dining services at universities that researches and implements these dimensions of menus of change and tracks that. And then it kind of acknowledges more the role that industry and corporations play in shaping demand, right? We always, those of us who've worked in efficiency, there's always this supply versus demand issue and what comes first. And here this takes the role of, corporations and restaurant industry in particular shapes demand, and they have the power to influence the tastes and the culture of food, while also meeting these criteria of health and sustainability. So this, oops, I'm trying to advance this. Tom, if you could advance the next one. So thinking about the technical potential of this focuses on food prepared outside the home. This number is at about 1/3 of all food that on average that Americans eat is consumed outside the home, or it's food prepared outside the home, increasing the rate food that's been prepared that we might take home and eat at home. But it's that category of food. And life cycle assessment of greenhouse gas emissions found it to have about 60% more carbon dioxide equivalent impacts for food prepared outside the home. And this is due mostly to people when they're getting this food, it has more chicken and beef and meat in it. The behavioral plasticity, when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about, we're looking at restaurants and institutional food vendors changing the menus they're offering, that then changes the food that, the end consumer public are eating, and reducing that overall greenhouse gas emissions. And so, in thinking about behavioral plasticity, there's just something that 55% of people have answered that they're interested in ordering non-meat meals when they're out at restaurants. We can think about this as the cost barriers are less than in other kinds of changes. But I often, having kind of moved more from very household energy and now doing household food, energy, and water, that the food choices, when I think about it, when we're doing energy, we talk a lot about the carbon lock-in, the technological infrastructure lock-in. On food, I think about it more as being a cultural lock-in. And so it's important to have kind of cultural adaptations and take this into account, trying to get people to shift their preferences. I think this program does a good job of that. And then this, but also the idea that as far as behavioral plasticity, that many, college students eating this way at college universities, restaurants eating this way, or serving more of these foods to people out, you have this potential for spillover in the home. Initiative feasibility, right? Folks are kind of talking about the power dynamics of these different options. And, I think that the initiative feasibility, the pace of implementation, the equity has in it, we should be doing power kind of analysis of power there, right? And kind of who's going to block it. I like this initiative because it identifies that, the industry are the leaders on this. And so far, they have the incentive to become leaders as their target customers move, but they're influenced by peer action, so that there's a lot of kind of organizational learning going on. And restaurants are used to kind of providing new food menu items and then either having them fail or having them advance. And so, and the pace of implementation, can be rapid. Like I said, menus can change pretty quickly. A lot of times it's seasonal. And then you can think about that changing preparation and sourcing, and those things can take a longer time, but can kind of transform through the life cycle. And then, equity, I said minor. I was trying to think through this, and economic accessibility of food prepared outside the home is limited, but if this is pushed out to things like public schools, and through kind of other venues, this could be something that brings health and reduced greenhouse gas emissions to broad audiences. And with that, I will hand it over to Paul.
Okay.
Thanks. My slide is about community solar, and I should say right off that community solar can be distinguished from two other models of diffusion of photovoltaics. One of them is the rooftop solar model, where you have homeowners and other property owners doing it for themselves. And at the other extreme, the utility-driven model, where you have a company that sells electricity anyway, deciding to produce some of it from solar rather than from fossil fuels. I'm looking at community solar. I should say that all of these three models can coexist. But look at community solar, an advantage that it has in terms of technical potential, especially compared to the rooftop model, is that it can broaden the market beyond the property owners with good sun exposure. And more generally, technical potential photovoltaics can produce fossil fuel, replace fossil fuels for all kinds of electricity production. Behavioral plasticity is an issue, and it is different for the different ways of introducing solar. For community solar, it depends on enabling legislation or regulations. That there are communities that have zoning laws that don't allow it to be changed, and financial incentives that can be created by federal, state, even local governments can alter the financial upfront cost and the return on investment for solar, whether it's for individuals or for communities. Community solar is well set up to apply key design principles for maximizing behavioral plasticity that have been developed for energy efficiency and also for adoption of PV. It can address financial barriers that exist for intended responders who don't have money up front. They can do it through the community, and it can address very important non-financial barriers for an individual small business or a homeowner. There's a lot of work involved in finding the best installer, finding the best equipment, evaluating the claims, and so forth. Doing it through a community lowers the transaction costs. Initiative feasibility I rate as moderate to high, depending on the policy context and public support, but a variety of change agents can take initiative, and it can begin with the ones that are ready to do it. It depends, as it says on the slide, on government's willingness to adopt incentives or enabling laws or regulations. And it depends on campaigns by NGOs at all levels to influence governments, and depends on private companies or local governments seeing benefits in supporting and facilitating community solar. The pace of implementation can be very rapid because it doesn't require changes in consumers' routines, and it doesn't require upfront financial investment by the individual or a small business. Also, it can proceed in advance of utility scale solar in receptive communities. Nashville is not receptive to mass transit, but college towns and places like that are sometimes receptive to community solar. They can, there's been talk in the chats about spillover effects. There can also be demonstration effects. Community solar can be proof of concept, move from one community to another. Equity issues depend on the design. But if the system is designed well to overcome barriers of low income, renter status, poor location, and so forth, it can score pretty highly on equity. I think I'm probably out of time, and I'll pass this on.
So sorry for that. That's the end of our presentation, and now we're going to turn it over to Reuven, who will lead us through the questions and comments that have been made in the Q&A. And I want to thank the panelists for everybody keeping on time, moving us forward, so we have plenty of time for discussion. Reuven, to you.
Yeah, thanks for this very enlightening conversation. And I have to say, there's been some fantastic discussion in the chat. I'm just going to, I mean, I've taken a few notes here just to flip through, and perhaps some of you would like to comment. First, with regards to first there was a very active discussion by Nat Treadway and others about how, you know, Mike, you put the picture of Model Ts or the cars in New York, and everybody's like, oh, that was just, you know, the big oil companies promoting it, and there wasn't a big
Right.
horse company, you know, to fight back. So what do you have to say to that?
Right. So I think I saw those comments. I've read through all of them, by the way, and I'm really excited about this format because I feel like even though we can't see each other the way I'd like in a personal setting, I feel like we can actually engage a little bit. So I saw that picture and I totally agree that that's an issue. So, you know, for example, the horse lobby was unable to stop the gas lobby in between 1900 and 1913. And we were in a period where government was not so powerful that it intervened to stop the gas lobby. And so the growth of fossil fuel vehicles. On the other hand, and I think that, so we might have a problem with electric vehicles where the gas lobby is able to intervene to stop them. But I would say I don't think that's going to occur. And the reason I think it's not going to occur is that we are not isolated in global markets from the rest of the world. I have a sheet that I show my students. You can go through almost every major motor vehicle manufacturer and you see they've already declared that they're switching to electric vehicles. Mercedes is no longer doing research on fossil fuel vehicles. Almost every one of the major Japanese motor vehicle manufacturers has committed sometime between 2030 and 2040 to phase out fossil fuel vehicles altogether. VW is going 50% within the next 5 years or so. And so I think what's happening is a major transition is occurring. And what's interesting from my perspective is I think we should assume that we'll get massive pushback. And we're already seeing that in Oklahoma. There is discussion about $1,000 plus charge to disconnect from the natural gas system if you want to go all electric with your home or your building. So I think we have to assume that this is going to be a titanic battle. The difference is that the battle isn't on losing terms because there are winners as well. Tesla recently announced that it was selling 100,000 vehicles to Hertz, the major auto renting company. We saw recently that Amazon bought 100,000 or ordered 100,000 electric vehicle trucks. So I think what we're going to see is major fleet purchases of electric vehicles. And then what's fascinating to me is look at the media. When a company has made major capital investments in electric vehicles, all of a sudden they take all that marketing power that's otherwise directed at selling fossil fuel vehicles and it turns all that marketing money towards selling electric vehicles. And so you get an engine going there. And then the next step that we haven't really studied enough, I think, in the literature is it goes from being inconvenient to have an electric car to being inconvenient to having a fossil fuel vehicle. And when that occurs, boy, are you going to see a flip. So if I were anybody in this audience, I just told my law students that this morning, I would not put my career behind doing things that require there to be a non-electrified fleet in a decade to 15 years. I think there is enough momentum there that absolutely will get pushback, but it's like a tidal wave that's going to overcome that pushback, given what I've seen so far.
Let me just throw in the notion of competing lobbies. You know, in the solar issue, you know, there's the gas and coal companies that are selling to the utilities, but the utilities don't really care where their power comes from. And so some of them may decide that we can make it ourselves and distribute solar.
Yeah, and Paul, there's a point, Ruben, that just came up in the chat, that maybe we can just have a vibrant exchange on this. And I saw it elsewhere earlier. You know, are EVs the Teslas for the wealthy? Or what are the environmental justice implications? And one of the pieces of research I have underway is to try to understand what the child and human health and maternal health effects will be of electrifying the motor vehicle fleet. Because much of the harm that's occurring in many neighborhoods, particularly in urban areas right now, comes from motor vehicle pollutions when it comes to asthma and things of that nature. So in addition, electric vehicles are more expensive on the front end, but they are cheaper to drive mile per mile because of the efficiency of an electric motor, and they don't need repairs. And so they're actually cheaper to operate. So we do have a major equity issue when it comes to the initial purchase of cars. And we also have an equity issue when it comes to installing electric charging situations in housing that is low income housing or subsidized housing. So that's a real challenge. But in terms of whether the equitable distribution of remedies is better or worse for electric vehicles, I think that's a really hard call unless you exclude the human health benefits and exclude the low cost of operating electric vehicles. So we'll see over time, but that's just, these justice issues as to transportation options, I think, are quite complex.
Thanks for that. I think that those are all excellent points, and this is a vibrant discussion. I do want to move on a little bit because this seems like we could go down a rabbit hole here. Tom, maybe this one's a good one for you. In the chat earlier, Kirsten Heinemeyer mentioned that she proposed another criteria for your framework, which is the potential for spillover behaviors. And does it build community? Is it a baby step to a more significant path? What do you think about that criteria?
I think that's an excellent idea.
Or two criteria.
Yeah, I mean, well, the spillover issue, of course, has become prominent in the literature recently. Mike has done some great work on this issue, as have many others. And I mean, there's been some pushback against a lot of initiatives saying, well, the spillover effects are such that there's really no benefit from shifting to renewables, for example, because it just increases the total amount of energy consumption. And I think we need those very, very careful, detailed analyses, and that in turn leading to careful design of the initiatives. So I think that's actually, while we don't want to elaborate a set of criteria without limit, I think that's a very reasonable one to add on. And I'm sure I didn't get you said potentially two new criteria. I didn't get the second.
Well, the spillover behaviors, and then specifically building community. Does it build community?
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of thinking about building community. It's a little tricky because some of the initiatives that people propose might or might not have any effect on community, but I suppose one could add that. Yeah, I also think that's a good idea. Or one might fold that into equity and think about sort of the social impacts, if you will, broadly, which could include not only equity per se, but also building community.
You heard it here first, folks. The new criteria added to the list of criteria.
I think I mentioned this in the context of my slide, but spillover is not just from one behavior to another, but it's also can also happen in terms of demonstration, from one community to another, from one government to another.
And actually, this leads nicely into another comment, or a couple of comments for Rachel. Karen Salvini mentioned that your food example has the capacity to lead to spillover to change in the supply chain, which is also a nice benefit. And that she thinks, and Ada Wara points out that it's an initiative with many indirect benefits associated with the banishment of animal factory farms and so on.
Yeah, I think that the idea of spillover, I know this group I've worked with a lot, and we've talked about various initiatives and thinking about particularly ones that focus on kind of industries providing information to consumers. So we've talked about carbon labeling with my co-authors here, and or this kind of role where, restaurant industry is pushing out new items to the public, but they're also going backwards. Part of the principles that are developed are things about transparency and sourcing and things like that. And that this group, we think a lot about how that pushes back through the supply chain and can change a number of behaviors from corporate industry, being pressured by one sector of industry. And so I think that we do see that as a real leverage point, and that this, the restaurant industry here, when we talk about the power dynamics, they have the power to say to their suppliers, without any regulation or, but to say, this is what we want to source, right? And how we want to source it. So I think that's something I see as promising in these kinds of approaches with retailers, really.
Indeed. And just before we move on to, there's like a lot of great questions that have been put in the Q&A, a lot of great initiatives I'm going to share with you, but I just wanted to point out one comment from Raina Caldwell about the solar example. I believe, Paul, you provided the solar example, that she agrees that community solar has a lot of potential, but until storage is developed, it can't fully replace fossil fuels. What do you think about that?
Well, I was thinking more of community solar feeding into the grid. It doesn't, community solar with storage applies to places that don't have access to the grid. There are a lot of those around the world. But in places where there is, where there is access to the grid, you still need storage, but there's a lot more flexibility.
Right, that's a good point. So I'm just going to quickly run through these initiative ideas I saw rolling in as you guys were talking, asking for initiatives. E-bikes, electrification of household heating, water heating and cooking, eliminating the sales tax for the purpose of purchase of EVs by low-income people. That's actually being proposed by the California legislature. Multimodal transportation solutions, which is kind of a catch-all for a number of things you had in mind. Curbside compost pickup. I'm happy to say that in my home city of Toronto, they do that, and many others, they're starting that. Community gardens is another one. And I don't know how this fits in. This is one comment, was green leases or green leasing. There's a change to the legal infrastructure of private contracts. It's not a technology, but a way to support the move toward environmental cooperation.
Yeah.
And thank you, Karen, on that comment about the compost. Sorry, go ahead.
So I think many of those are really promising. From my perspective, they're perfect for the kind of analysis that you take composting, for example. You can run it through those criteria and then hold it up against other options if you're a regulator or a change agent trying to figure out where to put your resources. And one of the things I saw, Ruben, as you were looking through those questions and as I looked at the chat, is this sort of sense that people have that, okay, electric vehicles are going to cause problems with the mining. Absolutely true. We have each of these things is an imperfect solution. Community solar will not produce electricity when the sun doesn't shine. Absolutely true. To me, that's just validation for the idea there is no panacea here. And all of these involve some kinds of trade-offs. And if you're in a decision-making posture as a regulator or the head of an NGO or an advocate or someone, we're constantly having to figure out what's the right assemblage. The only assemblage that I think of is totally wrong is the one that doesn't solve the climate problem, because I believe that 500 generations of people in the future will look back at us and say, how can you have not done what you could do to solve this problem? To me, that's the greatest problem we face, but that's just me.
Yeah, I just want to also add the issue of raising, one of the things that our group has always focused on in the last few years is the importance of the supply chain. Mike's written extensively about that. And so when we begin to think about equity effects, we need to think about supply chain equity effects as well. And that gets to mining rare earths and so on for electric vehicles. So that really should be something we consider when we look at the distributional or equity effects. It's not just in the community where the policy is being adopted. And Paul mentioned, if you really decline fossil fuels use, then there are going to be impacts in communities that are dependent on the fossil fuel extraction for jobs. So we need to think broadly about those equity impacts as well.
Just a word about leasing that somebody raised. Leasing can be an important way to deal with equity issues. That EVs and photovoltaics and a number of these things require upfront costs, and you can deal with the upfront costs with tax credits or rebates or something like that. But you can also deal with it by amortizing the upfront costs with the savings that are produced over a long period of time. And both governments and private companies can do that and have done that. Tesla does that with solar. They provide an option where you pay off the cost of the solar from the savings that you make on your electric bill. And that kind of model is useful for anything that has a high upfront cost.
Yeah, and just to get back to Mike's point earlier, last night, a few of us participated in the climate action role-playing simulation game. And it was really enlightening for those of us who were on the side of the fossil fuel industry or the forestry industries or the commercial interests, and how the opposition really does formulate itself. You know, and sometimes they're not wrong. You know, carbon capture and storage is important. You know, a carbon tax does affect low-income individuals more than upper-income individuals. Do you have any thoughts on how, you know, maybe we're not seeing the whole picture, and that the average person maybe at this conference doesn't appreciate the whole picture? And don't mean to, I mean, I'm saying including myself here.
Well, as Mike says, there are trade-offs. And, you know, if you're going to be serious about this, you do need to consider them. Some of them are not obvious. You know, the low maintenance cost of vehicles is not obvious right away. And, you know, carbon capture and storage, on the other hand, you know, there may be a place for it, but it's also used for greenwashing. The same with offsets. There may be a place for it, but it's a way. I think I saw somebody put something up about Bill Gates offsetting his personal carbon emissions by paying what doesn't count like much money for him, but it removes his personal sense of guilt.
$5 million is a lot for somebody else, but not for him.
Yeah, but for Bill Gates, you know, and there is this, you know, the other thing that goes on in a lot of organizations, both public and private, is an attention to reducing the carbon footprint of their operations rather than the carbon footprint of the supply chains produce their operations.
I have
Okay.
Go ahead, Ruben.
I'm noting that we have 3 minutes left in the session, and I really want to, I've been terrible in neglecting the Q&A box. So I'm going to ask you one question from the Q&A box, and then I'm going to have to wrap it up. And this question has to do with the sharing economy. Hazel asks, is the sharing economy model overlooked, especially in terms of addressing issues of equity? And we haven't talked really about the sharing economy because I think it kind of died when people stopped wanting to share because of the pandemic. But what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I
Is the
think
sharing economy a model of, I haven't addressed it to any particular person, so whoever wants to jump in on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a place where we have a lot to learn. I mean, in some sense, the sharing economy is the original economy for Homo sapiens. But I think where we are now in the 21st century is that we need to have lots of small experiments, seeing how things work, what works, doesn't work, why, and sort of build up from there. I'm not sure, you know, what the best examples are and how scalable they are, but it's certainly something worthy of exploring. Because I think once people get used to it, there's a lot of natural advantages that you know, there are a lot of folks who would just, well, trucks, for example. I mean, there are times when you need a truck. Many people need a truck, but that might be 1 or 2 days a year. So owning a truck is pretty inefficient for that. So in any event, I think it's a very good point. We have had kind of a pause in it because of the pandemic, and it's something that very much is worth experimentation and then evaluation of those experiments to see what's working, what's not working, and how it can be scaled.
I would put up a yellow flag here. I have the feeling, though I don't have the data, that the people who attend this conference have in common what they call in the literature universalist values. They care about the environment, they care about other species, they care about people of various income levels. Those are not the universal motivating values. A sharing economy sometimes is very consistent with those values, although it's also the case that in small communities, you can have a sharing economy among people who in the US political system are right-wing. They still are good neighbors.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I have to cut off the conversation here. It's been really a pleasure, and we are now at 5:15, which is officially the time of the end of the last session of the last day of the conference. So I want to bring it to a close by just saying thank you again so much to this panel, to all the panels, all the speakers, all the people in the back end, everybody who attended today. Thank you for staying on. Thank you for staying with us. And most importantly, I want to remind everybody that next year we are planning to be in person in Washington, D.C. And that if you want to stay in touch with the BECC community, do so at our free year-round webinars. Go to beccconference.org. You can see all the recordings I said in January here, but hopefully earlier than that. And yeah, please don't be a stranger. Please show up next year. And we do hope to be in a hybrid conference. There's been a vibrant discussion of whether we should be in person or not in terms of carbon emissions, and we are all over that conversation. So stay with us for next year, and thank you again. Bye, everybody.